Hey y'all, bienvenidos. Welcome to Tapas, the podcast that gives you life lessons in bite-sized pieces. This is your host, Yanessa, the scintillating spirit, here to help you on your journey of self-growth. So, come have a seat at the table, get comfy, and allow yourself the time and the space to enjoy some food for your soul. On today's episode, we'll be talking about boundaries, what that looks like, how we set them, and all of that fun stuff. So let's get into it. We're going to start off our show with Poniendo la Mesa. It's a very brief segment. We'll just be discussing boundaries and making sure that we're on the same page as to what boundaries are. We're working with the same definition. So for the purpose of this pod, we're going to look at boundaries as the lines that we draw to ensure our well-being. This is often the limits of what we will and will not accept. So that's going to be our definition for today's pod. We're going to go ahead and dive into our pan y tomate, which are the basics of the conversation of boundaries and all of that good stuff. Boundaries are absolutely necessary in all relationships. This is family, friends, romantic, and otherwise. I truly think that boundaries are an absolute necessity. I think that they allow everyone involved to feel seen and respected and safe. I feel that without boundaries, you invite undue hurt and can essentially breed unease when there are boundaries lacking and there's not a presence of boundaries. With that in mind, I think another basic kind of principle when it comes to boundaries, at least in my opinion, I do believe that boundaries require that you identify your needs and your priorities, and I think that clarity is something that is always going to be inherently good. I think the clearer that you can be about what you need and what you want in order to feel safe, in order to feel authentically you, is always going to be something that is beautiful and positive as opposed to a net negative. So when considering your needs and your priorities, I think some questions that come up so that you can figure out your boundaries are going to be what feels comfortable and safe for you. What do you need to feel your most authentic self? What prevents that or even actively works against it? So these questions, I feel, will help you reflect and form the basis of your specific boundaries. And they will vary person to person in terms of what you may need from a relationship with somebody who's an authority figure, right? Versus somebody who is your partner, whether it's romantic or whether it's business or whatever the case may be, right? Next, I do think another basic for boundaries is that boundaries are your responsibility to uphold. I think it becomes really easy when we discuss boundaries to feel that they are the responsibility of the other person involved within a relationship. However, at the end of the day, only you're responsible for actually upholding the boundaries. And so what I mean by that is that you are the only one who can enforce them. You can communicate a boundary, but if someone disrespects or disregards that boundary, it's your job to hold them accountable. They're not going to hold themselves accountable, right? There needs to be consequences for when a boundary is disregarded or disrespected, and the other party is never going to be responsible for that. That's only ever going to fall to you, right? So if I say that a boundary for me is that you will not address me by yelling, for example. Let's say that for me personally, any type of communication, I want to make sure that we are approaching it with some type of level-headedness. And so screaming at me is an immediate no. That's a boundary that I have and that I maintain in pretty much all of my relationships. And so that for me, if that is a boundary and somebody decides to yell at me, it's not going to be up to them to then enforce whatever consequence or uphold that boundary. It's going to be up to me to then step in and be like, hey, listen, actually, that's not okay. That's not appropriate for me. If we're going to communicate, if we're going to have any type of conversation or relation with one another, you need to address me as such or address me in this manner. And so then it's my responsibility to uphold that and to step in and to be like, oh, this is how we're going to do this respectfully. And if we can't do this, if we can't play by these rules, then we don't have a reason to be talking right now, whatever that looks like for you. But I do think that boundaries are your responsibility to uphold. And I do feel that it's quite easy at times to expect that other people are going to be the ones upholding them. But I think that it's your responsibility. I don't think it's true or fair to expect other people to kind of uphold your boundaries. And so with that, in that vein, I think boundaries do require enforcement. And in that, you need to consider what are going to be the consequences if someone disregards or disrespects your boundaries, especially after you've communicated them. So sometimes we don't know our boundaries. You know, to a certain extent, some of your boundaries, but sometimes there will be opportunities that arise, situations that happen, that unfold, where you recognize, ooh, no, that doesn't make me feel good, that doesn't make me feel safe, that doesn't make me feel seen or valued or respected. New boundary unlocked, I would like for this not to be. And then through that contrast, you can better sort out, okay, for example, we're going to go back to the yelling example just so we can keep to something consistent. Let's say that that's not a boundary I necessarily knew that I needed before, but in the recognizing of someone yelling, that contrasting experience allows me to realize, no, I need someone to be able to approach me in whatever problems or communications that they need to relate to me, that they do so in a level-headed manner and that they do so meeting me where I'm at here and not in an elevated state of emotional being because I find that that triggers me or whatever the case may be. So you need to consider what are the consequences if somebody does disregard or disrespect that. Again, this is your responsibility to enforce. So you need to be sure that these are consequences that you feel comfortable enforcing and that you can make sure that you do when the time does come. So questions to consider when considering how or what the consequences are and how you will enforce them are: how will you communicate this when it happens, and how will you move forward? I think that one's really important because, you know, like, we're humans, we're prone to error, and also when we're triggered, sometimes we react and we're moving from a place that isn't fully informed, or perhaps informed is not the word that I'm looking for, but that is not fully within ourselves. We're not fully present. Sometimes our ego and our inner child can be moving from a very vulnerable place, and suddenly we're kind of in autopilot. And I think that if you've ever been through an experience where you've quote unquote seen red or blacked out, I think that you can understand how people arrive to these places. And it's not, obviously, if given the choice, we don't choose to black out or to see red and to lose control of ourselves. However, that being said, that does happen. We are humans, to err is human, and we're all experiencing this life, you know, at the same time for the first time. How will you address it? How will you communicate it? Do you communicate it in the moment? Do you circle back? Do you just like, okay, we need a timeout. I'm going to respectfully remove myself from the situation. I think perhaps is there going to be a time gap between you and that communication with that person? And then when you do communicate it, how do you plan to move forward? Do you address it and then give the alternatives of, okay, this is not okay, this is my boundary, instead of yelling at me? I would prefer that if you are in the heat of the moment, only capable of arriving at this level, if you need to leave the situation, if you need to do breathing exercises, if you need to do whatever, right, to arrive kind of back here, then like by all means. But how can we, is it a conversation with them? What does that look like? So let's go over those basics again for boundaries. So first and foremost, they're absolutely necessary for all relationships. I don't care if it's your family, I don't care if it's a friend, I don't care if it's romantic, they are absolutely essential for every relationship. They require that you identify your needs and your priorities. How do you best feel safe and seen and authentically you? That'll help inform and bring clarity to what boundaries are necessary for you. Boundaries are your responsibility to uphold, no one else's. And so that being said, you have to think through what are the consequences when someone disrespects or disregards your boundaries. And finally, boundaries require enforcement and require your enforcing and reinforcing them. So those are kind of our basics of boundaries. We're going to get straight into my thoughts on the topic. So this is our tapas section, our meats and our cheese, so to speak. And honestly, like, boundaries, I think that they are, I know I've established that I feel that they're very necessary, but I think that there's a lot of misconception perhaps when it comes to boundaries. I think that they get a bad rap. I feel as though boundaries are often perceived as having a negative connotation. It feels as though boundaries are limiting. And so by virtue of establishing boundaries with people, that you're limiting the connection that you have with them. And I feel that this is in part due to the fact that boundary setting isn't necessarily normalized in many societies, or at least growing up for me, that is not something, and present day, something that I see happening with normality, with a sense of commonplace energy, so to speak. Again, I think that boundaries are something that are overwhelmingly positive when we shift the perspective to why we're setting them, as opposed to actually the boundary itself. So if we reframe it as, I'm establishing these boundaries, I'm communicating these boundaries so that I feel safe and so that I feel seen and I feel authentically myself, etc., so that I can feel that I can fully be vulnerable with these people or whatever. I think that that helps to bring back the positive, the net positive energy of a boundary. It's my first thought. I do think it gets a bad rap. I do feel that they're so unbelievably positive and necessary. And despite their positivity, I will say they can be incredibly difficult, especially to establish with family, or at least that has been my experience. I think depending on your cultural background, there are a lot of stigmas, there are a lot of misunderstandings. I think that, going back to that previous point that I brought up, it gets a bad rap. I think that depending on your culture background, and so I'll speak from my own, I know within a Latino family, the dynamic is very hierarchical. There is the patriarch, there's the matriarch, there is this idea that every generation that's above you is due a certain amount of respect. I grew up in a family that had this mentality that blood is thicker than water. You know, again, with the generational hierarchy of the family, even if the grandparents or the parents are wrong, there is a certain amount of you just suck it up and you just let things go. You let people speak or behave or treat others in a certain way, and you just grit your teeth and you bear it. And so I think when you grow up in a situation like that, where it's not a norm to communicate or to have boundaries, even where privacy is a luxury, it's not a right, it's not something that you are entitled to, but in fact it's the opposite, especially when you're living with family or things of that nature. Then I feel that clarifying what your boundaries are and then establishing them with family can be incredibly difficult. At least they definitely were for me, and continue to be something that I am actively working on. All of that to say, though, it's still so incredibly important that you set these boundaries, that you establish these boundaries. It can feel like a lot, but I think, again, calling back to the fact that boundaries are there. We set them, we establish them, we enforce them so that we feel seen, so that we feel safe, so that we feel authentically us, so that we can feel vulnerable and love in the most expansive ways. And so it can be a hard pill to swallow when the actions do not demonstrate these things. But remember that you are worth loving and having your boundaries respected. So I will address this more in the postre section, because my personal anecdotes actually really center on establishing boundaries with family in particular and what that has looked like. But I do think, at least in my experience, that some of the hardest boundaries to set are going to be with your family, but it's so important that you do it anyway. I think, again, often it feels like our boundaries, or the lack thereof, are born from family dynamics. So to go back to that same family and then establish new boundaries can feel a lot, but they're so important and they're so necessary, and we are all so deserving of being loved and having our boundaries respected. And so it's incredibly important that you recognize what boundaries you need, especially with family, and that you stand firm on the why of the boundaries, and you be patient. There's this need for patience, especially with older generations, because it's going to be incredibly hard for them to understand, because it's not something that they necessarily had the luxury of. always. And so being able to communicate them and working with your family on what your boundaries are and what boundaries they may need with you, etc. And doing that while also being firm on no, and this is still the boundary, and I've communicated this, and these are the consequences when those things do arise. So necessary, because we can only learn and grow together. And a big part of that's going to be accountability, both on your part for upholding, because again, you're the only one who is responsible for upholding the boundaries, and also on their part for being able to recognize their own behaviors and kind of like course correct as needed, because there will be a lot of course correcting that needs to happen. All right, I'm feeling really good about the pace with which I'm moving through today's pod. Like, who is she? Anyway, we're gonna move into our te, which is the question segment of the show. Sip our little te. I got 2 questions this week, so I'm excited to dive into them. And yeah, let's get into it without further ado. So, what are some small boundaries that you started with someone knowing you had to work up to larger ones? So, I think perhaps my father might be the best example of this, or he might even be the only person that I can think of off the top of my head. Even as I mulled this over, I don't know that I've really tried to introduce small boundaries before bigger boundaries, so to speak. But I will say that when I first recognized, and when I go back with hindsight and recognize boundaries that I began to set with my family, I do think my father was one of the first people that I started to set little boundaries with. And so with him, it had a lot to do with how we would converse and specifically debate, because my father, bless his heart, he's a Gemini. He is a Gemini man with a Leo rising and an Aries moon. So if you're an astrology person, just imagine. I think you can get a picture. And so he is somebody who really does enjoy playing devil's advocate or arguing for the sake of arguing, and really just, we'll leave it at that. And so these types of conversations would come often because he would make a comment that to essentially instigate something, to try to get a rise out of me. And whereas young teenage Janessa would I recognize that post-college me, I actually think the first time I really started to put these smaller boundaries out into the water and test them out was in the pandemic, when he would give me a ride to the grocery store and we would go grocery shopping together. And I remember that he asked me something that was meant to provoke me regarding the Columbus statue here in Chicago. And I used to teach history, and my family has always kind of poked fun, I guess, at the fact that I'm somebody who very much is about social justice, and I care very deeply about social issues, and I am definitely the person who will make you uncomfortable at Thanksgiving dinner because you voted for Trump, which whole other conversation. Okay, we're moving forward. Anywho, so this comes up, and he essentially is trying to get a rise out of me. And I start to talk, and he has had the habit of interrupting, especially when he's excited. And so he wouldn't let me finish speaking. He would have the habit of trying to talk over me and tried to speak louder than me. And so I remember this specific conversation is the first time that I actually established this kind of boundary with him. And I let him know, listen, I would love to talk to you about this. I am more than willing to listen to what you have to say. I need us to be on the same page about how this conversation is going to flow, though, because I do not want to engage in a conversation where I feel interrupted and I don't feel listened to. So I can let you know that I will make sure that I am actively listening to you. I will let you finish. I will not interrupt you. I will make sure that you have shared all of your piece before I speak, and I expect that same thing in return. And if there's something that you need, let me know for us to have this conversation. But I know for me, I am not going to feel good having a conversation with you, specifically having this historic debate with you, if you're going to continue to try to cut me off or speak over me or not listen. And so there was, it wasn't magic. It wasn't like I said that and then he just let me talk. He multiple times would try to cut me off. And so the first time I was like, hey, if you cannot do this, we will not continue this discussion. I don't have an issue ending this discussion. I would much rather us sit in silence in this car ride than to engage in a discussion where it's not a discussion. You're just trying to talk over me. And so he was like, oh, okay. And then he would like let me, and then he would get excited again. He'd interrupt me again. And I was patient, but firm. Every single time that he interrupted again, I would just repeat kind of that sentence. Like, again, if you cannot do this, we will not continue this conversation. I've established what I need. If you do it again, we're just going to end the conversation. And it actually ended up being one of the most incredible conversations I ever had with my father, because he went from trying to instigate me to suddenly actually being curious. And I won't get into the details of it because the history nerd in me will really take over. But essentially, I shared some facts with him Christopher Columbus. And he was like surprised. He's like, oh, I didn't know that he committed all these different atrocities. And I go, yeah, he was a horrible man. He was so horrible, his own brother turned him into the Spanish crown, and they stripped him of his titles, but they kept all the spoils, all the gold, all the things that they had collected because of his adventures. And so then where he might normally have not even allowed me to arrive to these points of like teaching him something, but like also probably tried to have instigated something else, he instead asked me, well, if he's such a horrible person, why do we celebrate him? Why do we get a day off because of Christopher Columbus? Why are there statues of him? And I go, that's a really great question, Father. Let me tell you about the Catholic Church. And like, it became this really incredible conversation. And honestly, I can say with like 90% certainty that were it not for this establishment of boundaries, of like, this is how we will have these types of conversations, we wouldn't have arrived to this point. Because every other time that we would discuss anything or debate anything regarding these types of things, it was just like him trying to speak over me, him not listening, me getting frustrated, and then just like a lot of blowing up and nothing being accomplished other than blowing up at one another. And so that was one of the first times that I established a boundary with like a parent, I think. Maybe not one of the first times. I'd have to really reflect on that. But one that I look back on, I was like, wow, that's like something that actually ended up being really... Hi, baby. You want to hop up? Evie walked in. Anyway, next question. So, what are the ugly parts / things that come up after setting boundaries? I think, again, I acknowledge, and as somebody who has been the primary boundary setter in all of my relationships, I don't know that there is a friendship or familial relationship or other romantic relationship or otherwise where the other person communicated them first or asked about them. I'm pretty certain that I've always been the one who establishes and asks for boundaries so that I can better understand and that me and the person in whatever dynamic that we're in feel comfortable and safe and valued by one another. But so all of that to say, with all of this experience, I can so firmly acknowledge how difficult boundary setting and enforcing and maintaining can be. And I do think that there are a lot of different little parts that can feel not fun, that can feel ugly. But I think that perhaps the hardest is learning that for whatever reason, the person that you set boundaries with simply does not want to maintain a relationship with you if it requires that they maintain or respect your boundaries. It sucks. Because boundaries and setting them are coming from a place of love. It's coming from a place of, I love and care about you so much. I want us to have a relationship where you feel safe and seen and valued, and I feel safe and seen and valued. And unfortunately, it feels as though on my end, I've not felt seen or safe or valued for whatever different reasons. And I would like to establish these boundaries so that I can, and also like you can let me know what you need. And I'm more than willing to show up in those ways that I can and make sure that I'm respectful of your boundaries. But, you know, at the end of the day, we all make choices. And sometimes people choose that they, again, intend to decide that it's just not, they're not going to respect those boundaries. And so that means that they're not going to maintain a relationship with you. And that does, I think that's a really like ugly part of boundary setting. I think it hurts more so the closer you feel or want to feel with the person that you're establishing that boundary with. I think having to follow through on enforcing your boundaries and the consequences when they're not respected can feel tough. For me, a lot of the consequences are quite simply losing access to me. So following through on pulling back and not giving access can feel cruel, especially if that person exists within another dynamic, within a group dynamic or within a family or friend group, because then it's like, okay, well, you, for whatever reason, chose that you weren't going to regard or respect my boundaries. And so now I'm responsible for enforcing these boundaries and enforcing the consequences of you choosing to not respect them or regard them. But we also exist within a group setting. And so that can be kind of tough and tricky too. So I think like with that in particular, also figuring out how to respect your boundaries when it comes to a person who does exist within a group dynamic as well is something that's super important. And so things to consider and things that I've had to consider is how do I interact with this person in group settings? How do I communicate my boundaries with the other group members, etc. And that's actually going to be a perfect segue into the next segment, which is our postre segment. This is the personal anecdote, my personal experiences I get to share with you regarding the topic that we're discussing today. And as I mentioned previously, I'm going to be talking about setting boundaries, but in particular with my family. And I've done boundary setting I've already mentioned with my father. I've done boundary setting with my siblings, and I've also done boundary setting with my mother. And I think that each of those experiences have been quite different. And so we're going to delve a little bit into them. I'm going to try to keep it like light, but also if I get emotional, boundaries aren't like, this is emotional. A lot of the topics we discuss on this pod are emotional. And, you know, emotions are important because they cue us into what is important to us. So let's get into it. So I already mentioned with my father, honestly, it's been small steps in terms of setting boundaries, a lot of patience. I think on my part, I'm sure on his part also, I mentioned his Aries moon. I also have an Aries moon. We're not going to get into that. A lot of patience has been needed, a lot of correcting, and a lot of unlearning what the dynamics of our relationship are. And when I say that, I mean, again, because culturally there is this like hierarchical expectation of like, I'm big and you're small and I'm right and you're wrong. And so I feel pretty confident in saying that I have the first, maybe the only, to establish these types of boundaries with my parents, with my grandparents, etc., with my family. And so it's new and it's different and it completely shifts the dynamic. It is going from I'm big and you're small, I'm right and you're wrong, and you don't talk back to me and you just let me talk to you any which way, to no, you're a human with your feelings, I'm a human with my feelings, and I want to make sure that we both feel safe and seen in these conversations, in our relationship with one another, in our interactions with one another. So how are we going to do that? And so I love my father so much, and I think that for all that he has the opportunity to grow, he really has, I think, progressed so much more than I think little me and teenage me could have even imagined. And I definitely have to give him his flowers when it comes to that, because I know that might not necessarily carry over to his other relationships. I'm hopeful that it does, because I do think that's another really net positive about boundaries, especially when you're establishing them with family and with just like people who are older than you that you have relationships with. I think it provides the opportunity of just positive modeling, because then they can recognize what boundaries they need and how maybe they might establish those with other people in their life, including you, but hopefully also other people. So yeah, father, honestly, kudos to my father. I've already delved into that, so we're going to move forward. My siblings, honestly, actually may have been the easiest for me to set boundaries with. And I think something that I love my siblings so much. I feel unbelievably grateful that I have positive relationships with my siblings, that I just came from a market on the river with my brother just now. We spent the morning together, we got some breakfast, we went to this thing, and I go to happy hour with my siblings and we meet up and do our rose thorn of the week, the week and things like that. And I know that not everyone has that kind of relationship with their siblings, and so I feel so blessed that I do have that. And there is a quote that I found forever and ever ago that basically was something to the extent of how siblings exist outside of the boundary or construct of time, because even though we are now all adults, it's our relationship is timeless. I through every part of my journey, well, almost every part of my journey, I'm the oldest of 6, but through the majority of my life, I've had siblings. Like there's a year and some change before my first sibling was born, the same sibling I hung out with today. For the majority of my life, I've had siblings. And so all of these eras of my growing have been alongside them. And we've constantly been seeing one another grow. And so I think that I'm so lucky, so blessed. I just think that like the love that we have for one another just made establishing boundaries with them so much easier. And I also think that because there wasn't a power dynamic, like, yeah, I'm the oldest, but it's not like I'm a parent or, like one of us is like more important or, etc. than the other. Like that dynamic doesn't exist in the way that it does with my parents, in the way that it does with my grandparents. And so I think that the combination of all those different things made it a little bit easier to establish boundaries with my siblings. And honestly, I think that the like biggest boundary that I kind of set with them, and that has essentially just kind of made other things that maybe I might have needed to obsolete, is we went from being a family that was constantly roasting one another to one that like is far more respectful in that regard. I communicated years ago that I actually didn't want to continue to connect in that way because it just didn't feel my 2 siblings who I spent the most time with, same 2 parents, closest to me in age, we're all air signs. So we all have the gift of gab. And we can all be very precise with our words, and we are very aware of each other's insecurities. And so just one of those things where it's like, for me personally, it felt like roasting one another didn't feel like something that bred more like love and appreciation. I feel like it just resulted in undue hurt, unneeded divisiveness, and unneeded hurt. So I communicated years ago that that's essentially not how I wanted to connect with my siblings anymore. I wanted to joke around with them as opposed to like joking around with one of us being the butt of the joke, like the joke being at the expense of somebody else. And so I communicated that forever ago, and I have not had that issue with my siblings since years. My brothers still joke around that way amongst themselves sometimes, but they don't do so with me as the butt of the joke. And also, I think they do so more within the privacy of their own relationship with one another. Like, they're just hanging out. But even within group settings, if there's a whiff of them, I'm very quick to be like, no, why are we insulting each other? And I'm very appreciative of the fact that they have, like, adapted, because it's a lot of years of unlearning. Our whole family has always done this idea of roasting one another, and so to go from that to not doing that, I recognize was an undertaking, and my siblings like nothing. And so anyways, I'm really appreciative. I'm very fortunate. I have very healthy relationships with my siblings, and I think that they empathize with me even if they don't always understand me. And I think that that is something that is more than I could have asked for, because I do know that I've been the black sheep of my family, and I'm not always the easiest for them to understand. I think especially my brothers, I think it's a little bit harder for them to understand me, but they will still try to empathize, and they will back me up, and yeah. Emotions. I love them very much. Moving on. Finally, my mother, this has been honestly the hardest. It's something that I've come to terms with over the past few years, a lot of reflection. And I think that establishing boundaries with her has really highlighted and crystallized the importance and the difference of impact versus intent, or intent versus impact rather. I'm very aware that my mother does not intend to hurt me, that she does not mean to hurt me. And that can be true at the same time that it is true that for years now, for the majority of my life, I have felt hurt by her, and I have not felt like we've had a healthy relationship in any regard. We have not had the closeness that I want, because who doesn't want to have that with a parent? So it's been a lot of reflection over recent years that I've recognized that, and I think a lot of that has to do with her own perception of herself. It's just not something I control. So I initially started to establish boundaries for myself regarding my mother, and that was years ago. And it was just me doing little things pulling back and just trying to not personalize everything. But I recognized that it would not effectively change anything if she wasn't aware. So I had a very, very difficult conversation with her regarding the matter, and I maintained my boundaries, and I communicated them to those that it was relevant to, because this is, of course, an example of somebody who's going to exist within group dynamics within the family. And that conversation happened about 7 months ago at this point, and there hasn't been any change. And that's been hard. That's been hard. Again, trying not to take it personal, but there is a balance of you establish boundaries because you really love a person and you really love yourself, and you're really hopeful that it can shift things into a healthy place where you and the other person can feel seen and valued and safe and authentically themselves and yourself. And so when it doesn't happen that way, it's hard. So I've continued to maintain my boundaries. I've reiterated them when questioned about them because I did establish what I needed. No changes happened. It recently came up because of a group dynamic where it became evident to her that oh, wait, are you not participating in this because of that conversation? And so that reiteration of the why. And I continue to reflect on those boundaries, honestly. And on my why most particularly, I think that's another important thing about boundaries, because they, like us, can be ever changing. So thinking about, are these boundaries still necessary? Am I okay with the consequences of them? And it's hard. It's so hard, but it's also so incredibly clarifying. And it's love for yourself at the end of the day, and for the other person, and for the relationship that you want to have with them. And so, yeah, that's been, it's been very interesting. I'm trying my very best to be vulnerable and transparent without just breaking down in front of a camera, and while also maintaining the privacy of, my mother also, because I love her. At the end of the day, like I said, I've established this because I love her. I've established these boundaries because I love her, and I know impact. I know she's not intending to hurt me, and also that doesn't negate the hurt that I've felt. And so just trying to honor those two truths, I think, can be hard. And I guess I'm sharing this because I've also spoken with people personally who have had mother wounds also, and who have also communicated with me how difficult it is to even broach the topic of establishing boundaries. And I do think it would be remiss of me to not recognize that in this moment, I don't necessarily have a relationship with my mother. I do, she's my mother, but we're not calling one another or hanging out or any of these different things. And I'm really hopeful that we arrive to a place where we have a healthy relationship, because I would love to see what that's like, and I would love to feel that love and that healthy relationship. And I know that, again, intent to impact, well, I guess I don't know. I would like to think, right? The same way that what kid wouldn't want to have a healthy relationship with their mother? What mother wouldn't want to have a healthy relationship with their kid? And maybe that's presumptuous, but again, intent, impact, I do believe that. But yeah, I do think that it is important to recognize that, it's hard, and I'm, at the end of the day, still so deeply optimistic. I do believe that we are going to arrive to that place, but I also know that we can never arrive to that place if I don't establish these boundaries, if we don't have these conversations, if I don't enforce them and uphold them, and the consequences aren't there. Because the hope is that, it pushes that expansion for both of us, and it allows us to reimagine what it can be like to have a healthy relationship. So that's a work in progress, and obviously an emotionally potent topic, but I did think it was important to address because it's so cool to see the successes, and it's not to say this is not a success, it's still very much in the works. And I feel very hopeful about it. And I think it's important to also share those pieces. And who knows, maybe in another episode, this comes back up and I get to share that I'm actually embracing and finding and seeing what a really healthy and loving relationship with my mother feels like and looks like, and but in the meantime, we're in it and we move through it positively. So let's get into our sobremesa. Now that I've gotten all emotional, this is going to be the last segment of the show where we being me, I give my last advice, my last thoughts, just last reflections. So all in all, boundaries are necessary in all of your relationships, not just in a romantic relationship, not just in work relationships or professional relationships, but in all relationships. Only you are responsible for upholding your boundaries. You need to make sure that if someone does not respect your boundaries, that you enforce and uphold them, because no one else is going to do it. Boundaries are love for yourself and for the other people who are involved. I think that that's so unbelievably important. They are love for your relationships. They're tenderness for your relationships, because at the end of the day, they're inherently beneficial to everyone involved. They model how you want to be loved and how you need to be loved and cared for and made space for. And it encourages your loved ones to do the same, to recognize how they can love and care and feel safe in relationship with you and with others, like hopefully a very positive ripple effect in that kind of manner. And also enforcing boundaries, they can be hard. They can be hard, but it gets easier with practice. And it's a reminder of your love for yourself. I love myself so much that I'm willing to set boundaries with my loved ones in pursuit of a healthy and loving relationship where all parties involved feel seen and valued and cared for and vulnerable in the best and most loving ways. And so, yeah, boundaries are hard, but they're important. And I guess if you take nothing else from today, let it be that boundaries are love. They're hard. They're important. And you're worth it. All right, y'all. Come back next time. I don't know what I'll be discussing yet, but we'll be discussing something else. All right, I hope that you all enjoyed this. Feel free to follow me on social media at Yanessa Wonders on YouTube and on all of the other social medias, TikTok, Instagram, etc. I will see you all in the next one. Hasta luego, beijinhos.